Hello, I'm Jessica and I'm going to tell you how my husband hid all his secrets from me. Welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories. It was just another scorching morning, and like every other day, I was alone at home, relishing the peace and quiet that only comes when the house is empty. My husband, David, was at work, and the kids were at school. This was my sanctuary, my time to unwind while completing the endless list of household chores that never seemed to end. As I tidied up, I couldn't help but crank up the volume on my favorite playlist. The music filled every corner of the house, drowning out the monotony of my tasks. There's something about loud music that liberates you, makes you feel alive. I found myself dancing through the house, broom in hand, moving from one room to the next, completely absorbed in the rhythm. It was during one of those moments, when I was deep in a particularly enthusiastic rendition of an old favorite, that the doorbell rang. The sound barely registered through the blaring music. I was too caught up in my routine to notice. Little did I know that this small detail would set the stage for something far beyond the ordinary. When I finally did notice the doorbell, it was too late. Whoever had been there was long gone. I shrugged it off and continued with my day, blissfully unaware of the turn my life was about to take. Later that morning, as I moved from the kitchen to the living room, something caught my eye. Through the dining room window, I noticed a figure in the backyard. Startled, I dropped the cloth I was holding and took a step closer to the window. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized who it was. Alan. Alan was a close friend of my husband, a familiar face at our dinner table on weekends. But what was he doing here in the middle of the day? My mind raced, searching for a reason. Then, I remembered the Cortador de Grama. He must have come to return it. I felt a pang of embarrassment as I realized how I must have looked, dancing around in my worn-out house clothes, completely oblivious to his presence. And then, another thought hit me. How long had he been standing there? I quickly composed myself, wiped the sweat off my brow, and made my way to the back door. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something odd. Alan wasn't just standing there, he was watching me intently. His expression was hard to read, a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't quite place. Hey, Alan. I greeted him, trying to sound casual despite the odd tension in the air. What brings you here? He snapped out of whatever trance he was in and gave me a sheepish smile. Hey, I came to return the lawnmower. I tried ringing the bell, but I guess you didn't hear me. I laughed nervously, brushing off the awkwardness. Yeah, I had the music on. A bit loud. Sorry about that, he shrugged, his eyes still holding that strange intensity. No problem. I left the mower in the back, thought I'd just drop it off and head out, but he didn't head out. Instead, we stood there, an uncomfortable silence stretching between us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that this wasn't just a friendly visit. My story isn't over yet. Please consider subscribing to the channel, thank you. Back to the story, as the silence hung in the air, I finally decided to break it. Do you want to come in for a drink? It's pretty hot out here, Alan hesitated for a moment before nodding. Sure, why not, I led him inside, feeling the tension ease just a little as we entered the cooler air of the house. I offered him a glass of cold lemonade, which he accepted with a grateful smile. We sat down in the living room, the awkwardness between us still palpable but slowly giving way to the familiarity of our usual banter. For a while, we talked about the usual things, work, the kids, weekend plans. But there was something different about the way Alan looked at me today. His eyes lingered a little too long, his smile a little too knowing. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that I was just imagining things, but then, as the conversation lulled, he brought it up, I saw you through the window earlier, he said, his tone casual but his eyes watching me closely, I felt my cheeks flush. Yeah, about that. I was just, dancing, he finished for me, a small smirk playing on his lips, I laughed, trying to play it off. Yeah, I guess you caught me, but he didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned in. A little closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You looked different. Relaxed. Like you were really enjoying yourself, there was something in his tone that sent a shiver down my spine. I met his gaze, trying to read what was going on in his mind, but all I could see was that same intense look from earlier, I was just having a bit of fun, I said, my voice a little shaky, he nodded, still watching me with that unsettling intensity. Yeah, fun, another silence stretched between us, this one even more charged than before. I could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words hanging between us, and suddenly, I realized what it was, this wasn't just a friendly visit. Alan was seeing me in a way he never had before, seeing me as more than just his friend's wife, and the most shocking part? A small part of me liked it. The realization hit me like a freight train, but instead of recoiling, I found myself intrigued. This was new, exciting, a forbidden thrill that sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. I knew it was wrong, that I should put a stop to it right there and then, but I didn't. Instead, I let the moment linger, savoring the tension, the unspoken attraction that was crackling between us, Alan must have sensed the shift in my demeanor because he leaned back, his smirk growing a little more confident. You know, we never really get to talk like this, he said, his voice casual, but the implication clear, no, we don't, I agreed, my voice softer now, almost conspiratorial, he took a sip of his lemonade, his eyes never leaving mine. Maybe we should change that, I knew where this was heading, knew that every second I allowed this to continue was pushing us closer to a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But instead of pulling back, I found myself leaning in, what do you mean? I asked, even though I already knew the answer, Alan's smile widened, his confidence growing with every passing moment. I mean, you and me. We've always been friendly, but maybe there's more to it than that, my heart pounded in my chest as his words sank in. This was it, the point of no return. But even as the rational part of my mind screamed at me to stop, to think of my husband, my family, I found myself leaning even further into the dangerous allure of the moment, what are you saying, Alan? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, he set his glass down and leaned forward, his face inches from mine. I'm saying that I've always admired you. That maybe, just maybe, we could have some fun together. Something different, his words hung in the air, thick with implication, and I knew that if I didn't stop this now, there would be no going back. But instead of pushing him away, I found myself captivated by the idea, the thrill of doing something forbidden, something that no one else would ever know about, and that's when I realized I wanted this. I wanted the excitement, the danger, the thrill of the unknown. I wanted to see just how far I could go, with a slow, deliberate movement, I leaned in and pressed my lips to his, the kiss was electric, sending shockwaves through my body. It was nothing like I had expected, nothing like the kisses I shared with my husband. This was different, charged with a forbidden energy that made my pulse race and my mind spin, for a moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of us in that living room, locked in an embrace that neither of us wanted to break. But as the kiss deepened, reality came crashing back, and with it, the weight of what we were doing. I pulled back suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to catch my breath. Alan, we can't, I know, he interrupted, his voice husky and breathless. But I can't stop thinking about you, about this, his words sent a thrill through me, even as guilt gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. I knew this was wrong, knew that we were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, the desire to throw caution to the wind and see where this would take us, we shouldn't, I whispered, but the words felt hollow, lacking conviction, maybe not, he agreed, his eyes dark with desire. But that doesn't mean we won't, and with that, he pulled me back into his arms, and this time, I didn't resist. Hours passed in a blur of stolen moments and heated embraces, each one more intense than the last. By the time we finally parted, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. I watched as Alan gathered his things, a strange mixture of satisfaction and guilt churning in my stomach, neither of us spoke as he headed for the door, the weight of what we had done hanging heavy in the air. But just as he reached for the handle, he turned back to me, his expression unreadable, it can't happen again, he said, his voice firm but laced with regret, I know, I replied, though a part of me wasn't entirely sure that was true, he nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer, and then he was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts, for a long time, I stood there in the empty living room, replaying the events of the day over and over in my mind. I knew I should feel ashamed, that I had betrayed my husband, my family, but instead, all I felt was a strange sense of exhilaration. This was a side of me I had never explored before, a side that I didn't even know existed. And now that I had tasted it, I wasn't sure I could go back to the way things were, as I made my way upstairs to shower and change, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That despite what we had said, this wasn't over, not by a long shot, days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal, at least, on the surface. I went about my daily routine, playing the role of the perfect wife and mother, but underneath it all, I was still reeling from what had happened with Alan. The memory of that day lingered in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the line we had crossed and the danger that came with it, and then, one evening, as I was preparing dinner, the phone rang. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered it, expecting to hear my husband's voice on the other end. But instead, it was Alan. "Hey," he said, his voice tense. "Can we talk?" My heart skipped a beat at the sound of his voice, and I quickly glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot. "What is it, Alan?" "I thought we agreed, I know what we agreed," he interrupted, his voice low and urgent. "But there's something you need to know, There was something in his tone that set my nerves on edge, a sense of foreboding that made my stomach twist. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I found out something. About David. Something you're not going to like, My blood ran cold at his words, and I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean? What did you find out?" There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear him take a deep breath. Before he continued, "David, he's been seeing someone else." I didn't want to believe it at first, but I saw them together. "It's real, the room seemed to spin around me as his words sank in. My husband, my rock, the man I had built my life with, was cheating on me. It didn't seem possible, but the certainty in Alan's voice left little room for doubt, Who is she?" I managed to choke out, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once, "I don't know her name," Alan admitted. "But I've seen them together a few times now." "I'm sorry, I thought you should know, I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me up. This couldn't be happening. Not after everything we had been through, everything we had built together. How could David do this to me? To us, but as the initial shock began to wear off, a new realization dawned on me. That sent a fresh wave of guilt crashing over me. I had betrayed him too, just as he had betrayed me. And now, I was caught in a web of lies and secrets that threatened to unravel everything I held dear, My story isn't over yet. Please consider subscribing to the channel, thank you. Back to the story. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and heartache. I couldn't stop thinking about what Alan had told me, about the possibility that my husband had been unfaithful. But more than that, I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at me, knowing that I had betrayed him too, finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be, One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I confronted David. We were sitting in the living room, the TV playing in the background, but I couldn't focus on anything other than the question that had been burning in my mind for days. "David," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "Is there something you need to tell me?" He looked up from his phone, a frown creasing his brow. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "I know about her. I know you've been seeing someone else, For a moment, there was silence. David stared at me, his expression unreadable, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to figure out how much I knew, then, finally, he spoke. "Who told you?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He didn't even try to deny it. "So it's true," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You've been cheating on me, he sighed and rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of the confession seeming to settle on his shoulders. "Yes. It's true. I'm sorry, I never meant for you to find out like this." "Why?" I demanded, tears streaming down my face. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" David looked away, his expression pained. "I don't know. It just happened. We've been distant for a while now, and I guess I was looking for something to fill the void, his words cut me to the core, but they also brought a bitter realization. He was right, we had been distant. The connection we once had seemed to have faded, replaced by the mundane routine of everyday life. And in my search for excitement, I had found myself in Alan's arms, betraying the very man I had vowed to love and honor, but that didn't make what he had done any less painful, who is she? I asked again, my voice trembling with emotion, David hesitated before answering. Her name is Emma. We met at work, the name meant nothing to me, but the betrayal stung just the same. I couldn't believe that he had been carrying on this affair right under my nose, that he had been living a double life while I had been trying to keep our family together, but as the anger and hurt boiled over, another thought crept into my mind, a thought that made my blood run cold, what if Alan had known about this all along? What if he had used this information to get close to me, to take advantage of my vulnerability? The thought was too horrifying to contemplate, but I couldn't shake the suspicion that had taken root in my mind. And suddenly, I realized that I was caught in a web of lies and deceit, with no way out. As the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being played, that Alan had known about David's affair all along and had used that knowledge to manipulate me. But I couldn't be sure, and the uncertainty was driving me insane. I tried to keep my suspicions to myself, but it was impossible. Every time I saw Alan, every time we spoke, I found myself questioning his motives, wondering if he was as innocent as he claimed to be, finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth, one evening, after David had gone to bed, I called Alan. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to stop until I got them, Alan, I said as soon as he picked up. We need to talk, there was a pause on the other end, and I could hear the tension in his voice when he finally responded. What's going on? I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Did you know about David's affair before you told me? Did you use that information to what? He interrupted, his voice sharp. To seduce you? Is that what you think? I hesitated, suddenly unsure of myself. I don't know, Alan. I don't know what to think anymore, There was another long pause, and when Alan finally spoke, his voice was filled with anger. How could you think that? I told you because I thought you had a right to know. I would never use something like that to manipulate you, The conviction in his voice gave me pause, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt, Maybe I was wrong. Maybe Alan was telling the truth. But the damage had already been done, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice trembling. I just don't know who to trust anymore, Alan sighed, the anger seeping out of his voice. I get it. This whole situation is messed up. But you need to trust me on this. I didn't know about David until recently. And I only told you because I thought you deserved to know the truth. His words brought a measure of comfort, but they didn't erase the doubts that still lingered in the back of my mind. I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he had my best interests at heart, but I couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that I was being played, and as I hung up the phone, I realized that I was more alone than ever, trapped in a web of deceit with no clear way out, The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I was caught between two men, two betrayals, and the weight of it all was suffocating. I couldn't look at David without seeing the betrayal in his eyes, and every time I spoke to Alan, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from me, I was spiraling, and there seemed to be no way to stop it, Finally, one night, everything came to a head. David and I were sitting in the living room, the tension between us so thick you could cut it with a knife. Neither of us had spoken about the affair since that fateful night, but the silence was eating away at us, I can't do this anymore, I blurted out, my voice shaking with emotion, David looked up, his expression weary. Can't do what? This, I said, gesturing between us. Pretending that everything is okay when it's not. We're falling apart, David, and I don't know how to fix it, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. I've been trying to figure out how to make things right, but I don't know if we can, the words hit me like a ton of bricks, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Was this it? Were we really about to throw away everything we had built together? But before I could respond, the doorbell rang, shattering the tense silence, we both froze, staring at each other in shock. It was late, too late for visitors. And the last thing we needed was another disruption. I'll get it, David said, standing up and heading for the door, but as soon as he opened it, I knew something was wrong. The look on his face was one of shock and confusion, and when he turned back to me, his expression was unreadable. Who is it? I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing the last person I expected to see standing on our doorstep, it was Emma, the woman David had been having an affair with. The woman who had turned my world upside down, and she was holding a baby, time seemed to stop as I stared at the woman standing in front of me, cradling a baby in her arms. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing about this situation made sense. Who is that? I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper, Emma looked at me, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear. This is David's son, she said, her voice trembling, the words hit me like a sledgehammer, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. David's son? How could that be possible? I turned to David, searching for some kind of explanation, but he just stood there, his face ashen, unable to meet my gaze, It's true, Emma continued, tears streaming down her face. I didn't want to come here, but I had no choice. David needs to know the truth, I felt like I was going to be sick. This couldn't be happening. It was too much, too overwhelming. But as I looked at the baby in her arms, I couldn't deny the truth. Staring me in the face, David, I choked out, my voice breaking. Is this true? He nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I didn't know. I didn't know she was pregnant until recently. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, the room seemed to spin around me as the reality of the situation sank in. My husband had not only cheated on me, but he had fathered a child with another woman. And now, that woman was standing in my living room, asking for answers that I wasn't sure I could give, for a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the air, and I could feel my world crumbling around me, but then, Emma took a step forward, her eyes pleading. Please, I didn't come here to cause trouble. I need help. David, I don't know what to do, David looked at me, his expression torn. I could see the guilt eating away at him. But there was something else there too, something that made my stomach turn, responsibility, this was his child, his flesh and blood, and no matter how much I wanted to hate him for what he had done, I couldn't deny the truth. This baby was innocent in all of this, and as much as it hurt, I knew that I couldn't turn my back on him. But where did that leave us? What did this mean for our marriage, our family? I didn't have the answers, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same again, in the days that followed, I was forced to confront the reality of my situation. My marriage was in shambles, my trust in David shattered beyond repair, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to walk away, there was a child involved now, an innocent life that had been brought into this world because of a mistake. And as much as I wanted to hate David, to push him away, I couldn't. Not when there was so much at stake. But that didn't mean things would go back to the way they were. Far from it, David and I had a long, painful conversation about our future, about what we wanted and what we were willing to sacrifice. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wasn't sure we would make it through, but in the end, we both agreed on one thing: we needed to try. For the sake of our family, for the sake of the child that had been brought into our lives, we needed to find a way to move forward, it wasn't going to be easy, and there were no guarantees. But we owed it to ourselves, to our children, to at least try, as for Alan, things between us changed too. The connection we had shared, the spark that had ignited between us, was now tainted by the truth. I couldn't look at him the same way, couldn't trust him the way I once had. And in the end, we both agreed that it was best to go our separate ways. But even as I said goodbye to Alan, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. Life has a funny way of surprising you, of throwing unexpected twists and turns your way when you least expect it, and as I looked at the child in Emma's arms, I realized that my story wasn't over yet. There was still so much left to discover, so much left to learn. My story isn't over yet. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Back to the story. Before you leave, remember to subscribe.